Alexander Sterling adjusted his perfectly pressed tie, glanced at a watch worth more than most people's annual salary, and sighed heavily. This was the 22nd interview in the last 6 months. The 22nd potential nanny for his twins, Finn and Olivia. The 22nd woman who would likely not last even a week in his perfectly organized, albeit somewhat chaotic, due to the children, penthouse in the heart of Manhattan. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Hayes is here," his assistant Jessica announced through the intercom. She was the only person who had managed to tolerate him for more than a year. "Send her in," he replied, mentally preparing himself for another disappointment. The door to his spacious office opened, and a young woman walked in. Alexander frowned. This was not what he had expected. Before him stood a girl in her early 20s, dressed in a colorful floral dress. Her hair pulled into a messy bun from which a few unruly strands escaped. On her shoulder hung an enormous embroidered tote bag that looked like it could hold an entire toy store. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she said, with an enthusiasm that seemed almost indecent at 9 in the morning. "I'm Sophia Hayes, but please call me Sophie." She extended her hand toward him. Alexander rose slowly, shook her hand and gestured to the seat opposite his desk. "Please have a seat, Miss Hayes." "Sophie," she corrected him with a smile, sitting down and placing her huge bag on the floor. "I heard you need a nanny for twins. How old are they?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. He was the one who asked the questions during interviews. 7 years old, but before we proceed, I'd like to see your resume. Jessica mentioned you have experience working with children? Sophie nodded and pulled a slightly crumpled document from her bag. "I was an elementary school teacher for 3 years, but the school was closed due to budget cuts. Now I'm looking for a job before I find something permanent for the new school year." Alexander scanned her resume, his frown deepening. "I don't see any experience as a nanny here." "That's true," she admitted openly. "But believe me, taking care of 27-year-olds at once is like being a nanny to a small army. 2 children are a picnic compared to that." A picnic. Alexander almost laughed. No one who knew his children would use such a term. "Ms. Hayes." "Sophie," she corrected him again. "Ms. Hayes," he repeated firmly. "My children are not average 7-year-olds. They are a challenge. All children are a challenge, Mr. Sterling. That's their charm." Alexander leaned back in his chair and looked at her carefully. She was young, energetic, and clearly naive. She had no idea what she was getting into. The last nanny lasted 4 days, the one before her 6. The record is 11 days, but she ended up on medical leave due to, he hesitated, exhaustion. To his surprise, Sophie laughed. "Sounds like fun. What do your kids do? Organize secret science experiments? Train for the circus? Try to take over the world?" Alexander was not used to such directness. Most candidates tried to impress him, assuring him of their professionalism and experience. Finn has a passion for experiments that usually end in disaster. Olivia collects spiders and other creatures she finds in Central Park. They are both exceptionally intelligent and creative. "They sound like exactly the kind of children I love working with," Sophie replied, her smile never faltering for a moment. "When can I meet them?" Alexander glanced at his watch. It was a habit that accompanied him throughout the day, every day. Time was his most valuable resource, and he hated to waste it. "I have a board meeting in 30 minutes. That's not enough time to go home and come back. So maybe tomorrow, or after work." Alexander sighed. He usually asked Jessica to schedule candidates for the weekend when he had more time, but Jessica had insisted that this particular person was worth meeting immediately. Now he understood why. She was a complete mismatch for his requirements, but she had the same spontaneous energy as his assistant. "All right, after work today. I'll be home around 6 o'clock. He wrote the address on a piece of paper and handed it to her. "Please be on time." "Of course." Sophie stood up energetically, grabbing her huge bag. "Should I tell the children anything about myself beforehand? Do they have any special interests?" Finn is interested in science and robotics. Olivia loves everything related to nature and animals. He hesitated, then added, "Please don't bring any candy. They have a strictly controlled diet." Sophie raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "See you at 6, Mr. Sterling." She headed for the door but paused for a moment. "Oh, and please don't worry. I'm sure we'll get along great with you and the children." As the door closed behind her, Alexander sank into his chair. This woman was the complete opposite of what he was looking for. He needed someone disciplined, methodical, with experience in dealing with difficult children. He didn't need a colorful tornado in human form who would probably only add chaos to his family's already complicated life. Sophia stepped out of the imposing Manhattan skyscraper and took a deep breath. The meeting with Alexander Sterling had been interesting. The man exuded control, from his perfectly tailored suit to his precisely planned schedule. He was also ridiculously handsome, which she had noticed immediately but quickly pushed the thought aside. This was a potential job, not a date. She glanced at the piece of paper with the address. Greenwich, Connecticut, of course. Where else would a New York millionaire with children live? Probably in a huge, sterile mansion where every object has its designated place and spontaneity is forbidden. Sophie sighed. This wasn't how she had imagined her career. She was supposed to be an inspiring teacher, changing children's lives through education. Instead, after her beloved school closed, she had to look for a job as a nanny for an overly controlling rich man. But she needed the money, and the position offered live-in arrangements and a salary significantly higher than an average teacher's pay. "I can stick it out until September," she muttered to herself, heading towards Grand Central Terminal. "It's only a few months." Boarding the train, she began to wonder what Alexander's children were like. They had to be special if they managed to drive away 21 nannies. She smiled to herself. She liked a challenge, and this one promised to be very interesting. Promptly at 6 o'clock, Sophie stood before an impressive residence in Greenwich. The building was exactly as she had imagined, modern, minimalist, with large windows and a perfectly manicured garden. She took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. The door opened almost immediately. Alexander Sterling stood before her, still in his suit, though without a tie and with the top button of his shirt undone, which gave him a slightly more human appearance. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," she greeted him with a smile. "You're punctual, that's good." He stepped aside, letting her in. "The children are in the living room." The interior of the house was spacious and elegant, decorated in muted colors with a minimal amount of decoration, but a lot of modern technology. Everything looked expensive and carefully chosen. "A beautiful home," Sophie commented, following Alexander. "Thank you. This way, please." When they entered the living room, Sophie immediately noticed 2 children sitting on the sofa. The boy was holding a tablet and drawing something on it, while the girl was reading a book. They both had dark hair like their father and similar expressive facial features. As soon as they saw them, they put down their activities and straightened up as if they were at a military inspection. "Finn, Olivia, this is Ms. Hayes. She is a candidate for your new nanny." Alexander introduced her in an official tone. "Hi, you can call me Sophie," she said cheerfully, approaching them and crouching down in front of them. "It's nice to meet you." The children looked first at her, then at their father, and then back at her. Neither of them spoke. "Finn is interested in robotics, right?" Sophie turned to the boy. "I once saw a robot that could solve a Rubik's Cube. It was amazing." Finn narrowed his eyes, as if judging whether she was telling the truth. "What algorithm did it use?" he asked suspiciously. Sophie smiled widely. "I have no idea, but I'd love to find out if you tell me." The boy looked surprised by her honesty. Most adults tried to pretend they knew about things they had no clue about. "And you, Olivia?" Sophie turned to the girl. "Your dad said you're interested in nature and animals." "I have 13 spiders, 2 snails and 1 earthworm," Olivia replied in a monotonous voice. "They all have names. Do you want to meet them?" "Absolutely," Sophie replied without hesitation, which clearly surprised the girl. "I always wanted my own pet spider, but my mum was scared. She said one of us had to move out, and since she was paying the rent—" Sophie shrugged with a smile. The corners of Olivia's mouth twitched slightly, which Sophie took as a good sign. Alexander watched this exchange with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. Most candidates either ignored his children's quirks or reacted with horror at the mention of Olivia's spider collection. "Maybe you can show Miss Hayes your rooms," he suggested, which sounded more like a command than a proposal. The children stood up at the same time like little robots. "Me first!" Finn shouted, grabbing Sophie's hand and pulling her towards the stairs. "No, me first!" Olivia protested, grabbing Sophie's other hand. And so, Sophie was pulled up the stairs by two suddenly animated children, leaving a stunned Alexander at the bottom. When Sophie returned to the living room an hour later, she was clearly amused and fascinated. Finn had shown her his robot projects, including one that was programmed to toss socks onto the chandelier. Olivia had proudly presented the terrariums with her collection of arachnids and told the story of each one, including the Overlord, a huge garden spider who, according to her, was planning to take over the house, but has agreed to a truce for now. Alexander was sitting at the dining room table working on his laptop. When he noticed her, he closed the computer and stood up. "So, what's the verdict?" he asked, crossing his arms. Sophie smiled widely. "They're fantastic. Finn has an amazing technical imagination, and Olivia is incredibly observant and sensitive. I understand now why the previous nannies had difficulties." "So you're quitting?" His tone suggested he expected such an answer. "On the contrary," Sophie shook her head. "When can I start?" Alexander looked genuinely surprised. "Are you sure? They haven't shown you their special talents yet. You mean the flower trap above the bathroom door or the baking soda experiment in the sink?" she asked innocently. "I noticed both and disarmed them before they could work." Now Alexander was truly astonished. "How? I was a teacher, Mr. Sterling. I know all the tricks," she shrugged. "Besides, I was a pretty creative child myself." The man looked at her for a moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Before we make a decision, I need to clarify a few things," he said finally. "I need someone who will live here from Monday to Friday. Weekends are free, unless we arrange otherwise beforehand. The children have a precise schedule of extracurricular activities and a diet that must be strictly followed. I do not tolerate lateness or disorder." Sophie listened, nodding, though internally she wondered if this man ever smiled. "I understand," she replied. "And may I ask, what happened to the children's mother?" The question popped out before she could think, and she immediately regretted her directness. Alexander's face hardened. "My wife passed away when the children were 3, he replied coldly. "Does that have any bearing on your decision to take the job?" "No, of course not," she replied quickly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." An awkward silence hung in the air for a moment. "So," Sophie cleared her throat, "when can I move in?" Alexander looked at her carefully, as if he still couldn't believe she was interested in the job. "Sunday evening. Jessica will give you the details regarding salary and duties." He extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, Miss Hayes." "Sophie," she corrected him automatically, shaking his hand. "Miss Hayes," he repeated with a hint of stubbornness in his voice. Sophie smiled to herself. This man was like a rock, hard and unyielding. But even rocks could be weathered slowly, drop by drop, and she had a lot of patience. On Sunday evening, Sophie stood at the entrance of the Sterling residence with 2 suitcases and her inseparable, enormous tote bag. She felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Could she really tame the little terrors who had driven away 21 professional caregivers? And could she survive living under the same roof as their perfectionist, control-freak father? Before she could press the doorbell, the door flew open. Finn and Olivia stood on the threshold, smiling broadly. "You came!" they shouted almost in unison. Behind them, in the depths of the hallway, stood Alexander, observing the scene with an unreadable expression. "Of course I came," Sophie replied, stepping inside. "I promised, didn't I?" The children immediately grabbed her suitcases, pulling them towards the stairs with surprising strength for 7-year-olds. "We'll show you your room," Finn announced. "We decorated it especially for you," Olivia added. Sophie looked questioningly at Alexander, who just shrugged. "I haven't seen what they did in there," he said, "but I checked to make sure there was nothing dangerous." "That's comforting," she replied with a smile, then followed the children upstairs. The guest room, which was to be her new home for the next few months, was spacious and elegant, like the rest of the house. The bed was perfectly made, and a fresh bouquet of flowers stood on the nightstand. But Sophie's attention was immediately drawn to something else. On the wall above the bed hung a huge poster with the colourful inscription, "Welcome, Sophie," and drawings that were clearly the work of Finn and Olivia. One depicted what looked like a robot with flowers instead of hands, and the other a collection of spiders of various sizes, all smiling. "Do you like it?" Olivia asked, watching her reaction. "It's wonderful," Sophie replied honestly, feeling a sudden rush of emotion. No one had ever prepared such a welcome for her. "The flowers are from me," Alexander said, appearing in the doorway. "I thought they might make you feel more at home." Sophie looked at him in surprise. She hadn't expected such a gesture from him. "Thank you, that's very kind," she said quietly. For a moment their eyes met, and Sophie could have sworn she saw a shadow of a smile on his face. But the moment quickly passed. "Children, it's time for dinner," Alexander announced, returning to his official tone. "Miss Hayes, will you join us?" "With pleasure," she replied, then added with a playful smile, "And you really can call me Sophie." Alexander just shook his head, but this time Sophie was sure the corners of his mouth had twitched slightly. "Dinner is at 7, Miss Hayes. Please don't be late on your first day of work." With those words, he left, and the children ran after him, leaving Sophie alone in her new room. She looked around, smiling at the colourful poster. "Well, Sophie," she said to herself, "looks like you're in deep." She wasn't sure if she meant the job, the children, or their handsome, though impossibly stiff, father. Either way, she felt that the next few months would be decidedly interesting. Monday morning began with an alarm at 5:30. Sophie groaned, rolling over. Who in their right mind gets up at this hour? The answer came immediately when she heard a knock on the door. "Miss Hayes." Alexander's voice was annoyingly crisp for this hour. "Breakfast in 30 minutes. Yes, I'm getting up," she mumbled, forcing herself out of bed. When she came downstairs promptly at 6, she found Alexander in the kitchen, already dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, preparing a smoothie. "Good morning," she greeted, suppressing a yawn. "Good morning," he nodded. "The children will be up in 15 minutes. Their breakfast is in the fridge, plastic containers with labels. Finn is allergic to nuts, so please make sure he doesn't eat anything of the sort." Alexander handed her a thick binder. "Everything is in here," he said. "Schedule, phone numbers, a list of foods the children can't eat." Sophie opened the binder. It was organized with surgical precision, with colored tabs and charts. "You're very thorough," she commented. "I'm responsible," he corrected her. "And I expect the same from the person who takes care of my children." 2 little tornadoes burst into the kitchen, Finn and Olivia dressed in identical navy outfits. "Good morning, Dad." "Good morning, Sophie," they called in sync. "Good morning, you two." Sophie smiled broadly. "Who's ready for breakfast?" Alexander soon left, leaving Sophie alone with the children. As soon as the door closed behind him, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed instantly. "So," Olivia began, playing with her spoon, "how strictly are you going to follow Dad's rules?" Sophie sat down across from them. "That depends on the rule," she answered honestly. "The ones about safety, absolutely. The ones about eating only organic products at weird hours." She shrugged. "Let's just say I'm open to negotiation." The children's eyes widened in surprise, then lit up with excitement. "I like you," Olivia announced. "You're different from the other nannies." The last one screamed when I showed her my robot spider, Finn added. A robot spider? Sophie raised an eyebrow. That sounds fascinating. Will you show it to me later? The first few hours passed surprisingly calmly. The children attended their online lessons, and Sophie studied the binder. The lives of these children were planned to the minute, filled with activities and a strictly controlled diet. There was no room for spontaneity. When it was time for lunch, Sophie suggested they make sandwiches together instead of eating the pre-packaged meals from the containers. But Dad says we have to eat only what's in the containers, Finn protested, though his eyes sparkled with excitement. We'll use the same ingredients, just in a different form, Sophie explained. It'll be our little secret. Making sandwiches turned out to be a chaotic but cheerful activity. For the first time, Sophie heard the children truly laugh, not the polite chuckles they displayed for their father, but genuine, uninhibited laughter. After lunch, according to the schedule, came rest hour. The children were supposed to spend this time quietly reading or listening to classical music. What do you usually do during rest time? She asked. We pretend to read, but we're really planning pranks, Finn replied with disarming honesty. Sophie suggested a game of Scrabble instead of the standard program. For the next hour, they played, talking in whispers and laughing quietly. She was impressed by the children's vocabulary, especially when Finn played the word quantification and Olivia responded with metamorphosis. When evening came and it was time for bed, the children informed Sophie that their father always read them one page from an encyclopedia before sleep. Maybe we could read something different tonight? Indeed, she suggested, finding a copy of Harry Potter on the shelf. The children's eyes widened. Dad says it's fantasy, not supported by scientific facts, Finn said, though his voice held a note of curiosity. That's the magic of books, Sophie smiled. They let us have adventures that aren't possible in reality. She began to read, modulating her voice for different characters. The children listened, mesmerized, so absorbed in the story that neither of them heard Alexander's footsteps. What's going on here? His voice broke the magical atmosphere. We're reading Harry Potter, Sophie replied. It's excellent literature for children their age. It's 8:20. The children should be asleep by now, he said, looking at his watch. After saying goodnight to the children, Alexander stopped Sophie in the hallway. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have established rules. The children go to bed at 8, after reading a page from the encyclopedia. It helps them develop their knowledge. I understand, but Harry Potter also develops vocabulary and, additionally, imagination and empathy, Sophie replied. Maybe we could reach a compromise. Encyclopedia on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, and adventure books on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. I'll think about it, he said finally. How was the first day? Wonderful. The children are lovely, smart and well-behaved. No. Incidents? He asked suspiciously. None, she assured him. Before they parted, Sophie asked, do the children have any free days, time when they can just be kids, play without a specific educational goal? The man looked surprised. They have time for play between classes, and we spend the whole weekend together, going to museums or parks. Maybe someday you could just take them out for ice cream, with no educational plan, just for fun. Ice cream is full of sugar and artificial colors, he replied, as if that explained everything. There's natural ice cream without added sugar, Sophie noted, and the pleasure it brings is priceless. Alexander sighed. Ms. Hayes, I appreciate your concern, but I am raising my children to the best of my ability. They lost their mother when they were young, and I promised myself I would give them everything they need to grow up into healthy and intelligent people. There was a note of pain in his voice that he tried to mask with firmness. The rest of the week passed in a similar rhythm. Sophie tried to follow the rules while introducing small changes that made the children's lives more colorful. They read Harry Potter, prepared meals together, and played board games during rest hour. The children blossomed under her care, becoming more open and creative. What's more, their pranks stopped. Instead of planning how to scare the nanny, they spent their time on constructive activities. On Friday evening, when Sophie came down to the kitchen after putting the children to bed, she found Alexander there. "I've noticed some modifications to the children's schedule," he began. Sophie froze. "The menu has been changed, rest time looks different, and Finn told me you've already read 5 chapters of Harry Potter. Technically, they're eating the exact same ingredients, just presented differently," Sophie defended herself. "And rest time is still quiet, just filled with games that teach strategic thinking. As for the book, the children love it." She expected a reprimand, but Alexander sighed and rubbed his temples. "Do you know what's most infuriating? The fact that the children have never been happier. Finn showed me a robot design he came up with himself. And Olivia, she's laughing all the time. I can't remember the last time she laughed so much." Sophie didn't know what to say. "And that's why I've decided not to intervene, for now. But please remember, they are still my children, and I have the final say in their upbringing. Of course, I'm not questioning your authority. I'm just trying to add a little color to their lives." The man looked at her searchingly. "You are like color yourself, Ms. Hayes," he said quietly. "You bring light into this house. And while some of your methods are unconventional, the results are positive." Sophie felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thank you, I really care about Finn and Olivia." "I can see that, and I appreciate it." He hesitated, as if he wanted to add something, but in the end he just nodded. "Have a good weekend, Ms. Hayes." Sunday came faster than she expected. When Sophie returned to the residence in the evening, she heard raised voices from the living room. "But Dad, why not?" It was Finn's voice, full of disappointment. "We've already discussed this." "It's inappropriate and unsafe," Alexander replied firmly. Sophie hesitated, but Olivia had already spotted her and ran over with a cry of joy. "Sophie's back!" she called, hugging her around the waist. Finn ran over too. "Sophie, tell Dad we can go to the festival in the park. There's a carousel and cotton candy, and all the kids from our class are going." Alexander sighed. "The children just found out there's a town festival in the park next weekend." "And Dad won't take us," Olivia interrupted him. "He says it's unhygienic and dangerous." Sophie looked at their disappointed faces, then at Alexander's tired face. "Well, I'm sure your dad has his reasons, but maybe we could find a compromise," she proposed. "For example, go early in the morning when there are fewer people. We can take hand sanitizer and stick together." Alexander crossed his arms but didn't immediately reject her proposal. "Those are dangerous rides," he said, "and that food full of sugar." "I understand your concerns," Sophie said gently, "but children also need normal childhood experiences. They can't grow up in a bubble." The man looked at the pleading faces of his children and then back at Sophie. "I'll think about it," he said finally, which elicited cheers of joy from Finn and Olivia. Later, when the children went to play, Alexander stopped Sophie in the hallway. "Are you always going to question my decisions, Ms. Hayes?" he asked, but there was no anger in his voice, more like curiosity. "Only the ones I find too restrictive," she answered honestly. "Your children are wonderful and deserve a bit of normalcy in their lives." "Normalcy," he repeated as if the word were foreign to him. "You know, I lost my wife when they were little. Since then, I've been trying to protect them from everything that could harm them." "I understand that," Sophie said softly. "But sometimes, by protecting them from everything, we can harm them in other ways. Children need certain experiences, even those with small disappointments or bruises, to learn how to cope with life." Alexander was silent for a long moment. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted finally. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been too controlling." "You're a good father," Sophie assured him. "You just need to loosen the rules sometimes." Their eyes met, and for a moment Sophie felt a strange tension between them, as if they had just crossed some invisible line. Alexander cleared his throat and looked away. "Good night, Ms. Hayes," he said, heading to his office. "Good night, Mr. Sterling," she replied, wondering if she had imagined it, or if she had really seen a slight smile on his face. The week flew by. Sophie found her rhythm in the Sterling household, balancing between following Alexander's rules and introducing her own small modifications that made the children happier. Reading Harry Potter became a daily ritual, and preparing meals together became Finn and Olivia's favorite activity. On Friday evening, as Sophie sat in the living room browsing a book, Alexander unexpectedly sat in the armchair opposite her. "I've been thinking about the festival," he began without preamble. Sophie looked up, surprised. "And?" she asked cautiously. "I've decided we'll go. All of us together," he announced, as if it were the most natural decision in the world. Sophie couldn't hide her smile. "Really? Finn and Olivia will be thrilled." "Yes, but I have conditions," he added quickly. "We'll go early in the morning to avoid the crowds. We'll take hand sanitizer, and no cotton candy." "Ice cream?" Sophie tried. Alexander sighed. "One small fruit sorbet," he conceded. "That's a very generous compromise," she said with a smile. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Will you be free on Saturday?" Alexander asked suddenly. "I know weekends are your time off, but I thought maybe—" He hesitated. "You could come with us. The children would be happy, and I'd be grateful for the support." Sophie was surprised. She hadn't expected such an offer. "I'd love to," she replied before she could think. "I love festivals." "I never would have guessed," Alexander muttered, but the corners of his mouth twitched in a barely perceptible smile. Saturday morning was perfect for a festival, sunny but not too hot, with a light breeze. Sophie arrived at the Sterling residence at 8, dressed in a summer dress with colourful flowers and comfortable sandals. When she saw Alexander, she couldn't suppress a smile. Instead of his usual suit, he was wearing light-coloured pants and a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked normal and exceptionally handsome. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she greeted. "New look?" "I decided a suit wasn't appropriate for a festival," he replied, running a hand nervously through his hair. "Does it look okay?" "You look great," she assured him honestly, much more relaxed. Before he could reply, the children ran into the hall, dressed in colourful t-shirts and shorts. "Sophie," Olivia called, hugging her, "are you ready for the best day ever?" "Absolutely," she replied with enthusiasm. "Who's ready for the carousel?" "I am!" they both shouted, jumping up and down. Alexander watched this scene with a mixture of amusement and anxiety. "All right, team," he said, clapping his hands. "We have a plan. First, the carousel, then games, then sorbet, and we head back before the biggest crowds. We all stick together and follow safety rules." "Aye, aye, Captain," Sophie saluted playfully, which elicited a giggle from the children and another barely perceptible smile from Alexander. The town festival was everything Sophie had expected. Colourful stalls, bouncy castles, carousels, music, and the smell of popcorn wafting through the air. For Finn and Olivia, it was like entering a fairy tale land. They ran from one attraction to another with wide eyes and open mouths. "Dad, can we go on the carousel?" Finn begged, pointing to a traditional carousel with horses. "I'll check if it's safe," Alexander said, approaching the operator and asking a series of questions about the ride's maintenance and safety. Sophie stood to the side with the children, shaking her head in amusement. "Your dad really cares about you," she said quietly. "We know," Olivia sighed, "but sometimes it's a little too much. He gives us vitamins every day," Finn added, "and checks our temperature every morning. Ever since Mom died, he's always afraid something will happen to us," Olivia explained, with a maturity surprising for a 7-year-old. Sophie felt a pang in her heart. Children understood more than adults gave them credit for. "Your dad loves you," she said, placing her hands on their shoulders, "and I promise we're going to have a wonderful day today." Alexander returned, clearly dissatisfied but trying to hide it. "The operator doesn't have a current safety certificate," he muttered to Sophie. "But the device looks well maintained, so—" He sighed. "Fine." The children shouted with joy and ran to the carousel. Alexander and Sophie stood on the sidelines, watching as Finn and Olivia climbed onto the colourful horses, waving at them with every rotation. "They look happy," Sophie observed. "Yes," Alexander admitted quietly. "I haven't seen them this carefree in a long time. Children need some carelessness in their lives," she said gently. "A little chaos and spontaneity." Chaos is not my natural environment," he admitted with a sigh. "I noticed," Sophie laughed, "but sometimes it's worth stepping out of your comfort zone." Their eyes met, and for a moment Sophie had the impression that she saw something more than just ordinary politeness in his eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. The day passed faster than they expected. The children rode the carousels, played carnival games, from which Finn won a plush robot, and Olivia, a small plush spider, and even convinced Alexander to eat cotton candy when they happened to pass a stall, and the vendor, an older woman with a warm smile, offered him a piece. "This is surprisingly good," he admitted with embarrassment, savouring the sweet treat. "Mr. Sterling, are you enjoying breaking the rules?" Sophie asked with a playful smile. "Don't get used to this sight, Miss Hayes," he replied, but his eyes were laughing. When it was time for sorbet, the children asked for permission to go to the nearby playground, which was visible from where Alexander and Sophie were sitting. "We can watch them the whole time," Sophie reasoned. "And they can play with other children." After a long hesitation, Alexander agreed, and Finn and Olivia ran happily to the swings, where a group of children their age were already playing. "Blueberry sorbet," Alexander said, handing Sophie a cup. "Organic, no added sugar." "Thank you," she smiled, trying a spoonful of the cold dessert. Delicious. "Indeed." They sat on a bench, watching the children and eating their sorbets, when Alexander unexpectedly broke the silence. "My wife Madeline loved festivals like this," he said quietly. "She always said I was too serious, too focused on work and safety. She wanted the children to experience life with all its colours." Sophie looked at him in surprise. He had never mentioned his wife before. "She sounds like a wise woman," she said gently. "She was," he admitted with a slight smile. "She was a music teacher, spontaneous, creative, full of life. My opposite." He hesitated. "When she got sick, everything changed. Pancreatic cancer. It progressed so quickly, we didn't even have time to prepare. Within 3 months, she was gone." "I'm so sorry," Sophie said sincerely, instinctively placing a hand on his arm. "I promised myself I would never let anything bad happen to the children," he continued, "that I would protect them from everything. But I think I overdid it, didn't I?" "You wanted what was best," she replied gently. "It's natural to want to protect them." "But instead, I was taking away their childhood," he sighed. "Madeline would have been disappointed." "I don't think so," Sophie shook her head. "She would have been proud of how much you love them and how hard you work to provide them with everything they need." Alexander looked at her with gratitude. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. "The same enthusiasm, the same joy for life." Sophie felt her heart beat faster. She didn't know what to say. Their moment was interrupted by Olivia's cry. They both immediately jumped up from the bench, but before they could react, they saw the girl running towards them with a smile on her face. "Dad, Sophie," she called. "I met Julia. She's in my class. Can we go to her birthday party next week? Please, please, please." Behind her stood a girl with curly hair, and her parents, smiling apologetically. "Sorry to intrude," the woman said. "I'm Anne, Julia's mum. Our daughter would love for Olivia to come to her birthday party next Saturday." Alexander looked as if someone had asked him to go skydiving. "That's very kind, but—" he began. "That would be wonderful," Sophie interjected quickly. "Right, Mr. Sterling?" "Olivia loves making new friends." She looked at him meaningfully, and he sighed, defeated. "Of course," he said finally. "We'd be happy to come." "Great!" Anne beamed, handing Sophie a card with the address. "See you on Saturday." As they walked away, Olivia threw her arms around her father's neck. "Thank you, Daddy. You're the best." Alexander hugged her, his face softening. "Anything for you, sweetie," he said quietly. Sophie watched the scene with warmth in her heart. Something was changing in the Sterling family, slowly but surely. When they returned home, the children were exhausted, but happy. After a quick dinner and a shower, they went to bed without protest, falling asleep almost instantly. Sophie was getting ready to leave when Alexander stopped her in the hall. "Thank you for today," he said. "I wouldn't have dared to take this step without you." "It was a pure pleasure," she replied honestly. "I haven't had this much fun in a long time." He hesitated. "I'd like to ask you for one more favor. Could you go with Olivia to that birthday party? I know it's a weekend again, but—" "Of course," she agreed without hesitation. "I'd be happy to." "Thank you," he said with visible relief. "I'll pay you double for the weekend." "You don't have to," she protested. "I really enjoy spending time with the children." A silence fell between them, in which only their breaths could be heard. They stood close to each other, perhaps too close for an employer-employee relationship. "Miss Hayes," Alexander began, but stopped as if he didn't know what to say next. "Yes?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just thank you for everything you do for my children." "Always at your service, Mr. Sterling," she replied with a slight smile, though she felt a strange disappointment. For a moment it seemed like he wanted to say something else. "See you on Monday," he said, opening the door for her. "See you?" she replied, stepping out into the warm summer night. Walking to her car, Sophie wondered what had just happened. Was she imagining it? Or was there some tension between her and Alexander? And was it a good or bad thing that she was starting to think of him as more than just her employer? Getting into her car, she realized that the festival had been a turning point, not just for Finn and Olivia, who had experienced real, carefree fun for the first time in a long time, but also for Alexander, who was slowly emerging from his shell of fear and control. And maybe, just maybe, for herself as well, because it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the fact that she was starting to feel something more for the stern millionaire with a softening heart. Monday brought a new week and new challenges. Sophie noticed subtle changes in Alexander's behavior. He was less rigid, smiled more often, and even asked the children for their dinner preferences, which caused them shock and excitement. "What happened to Dad?" Finn whispered to Sophie when Alexander left the kitchen. "He's so different." "I think he just remembered what it's like to be happy," she replied with a smile. On Wednesday afternoon, while the children were working on a science project in the living room and Sophie was preparing snacks in the kitchen, Alexander suddenly appeared. He had come home early from work, which was unusual in itself. "Miss Hayes," he began, standing in the kitchen doorway. "I was wondering—" He seemed strangely nervous. "Would you be interested in going to dinner with me?" "On Friday night?" Sophie froze with a knife in her hand. "Dinner?" she repeated, not sure if she had heard correctly. "Yes, dinner," he confirmed, staring at his shoes. "Out of the house, just the two of us. Jessica can stay with the children." "Is this—" Sophie searched for the right words. "Would this be a date?" Alexander looked up, and in his eyes she saw a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "Yes," he said simply. "I think so." Sophie felt her heart race. It was unprofessional, inappropriate, and potentially catastrophic. And yet, she wanted it so much. "I'd love to," she replied before reason could stop her. The smile that appeared on Alexander's face was the broadest and most genuine she had ever seen on him. "Great," he said, clearly relieved. "I'll pick you up at 7. "Nah, perfect," she replied, feeling butterflies in her stomach. "And maybe you could start calling me by my first name, since we're going on a date." Alexander hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Sophie," he said, and the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. "All right, Alexander," she replied with a smile. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other as if for the first time. And maybe it was. Maybe only now, after weeks of gradually getting closer, they truly saw each other. Not as employer and employee, not as a millionaire and a nanny, but as a man and a woman who, despite their differences, had found something in common, a concern for two special children and perhaps for each other. Sophie didn't know what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. Her life as a millionaire's nanny had just become much more complicated and much more exciting than she could have ever imagined. Friday evening arrived faster than Sophie had expected. She stood in front of the mirror in her room, assessing her appearance. She had chosen a simple but elegant black dress that accentuated her figure, delicate makeup, and her hair up in a loose chignon. Promptly at 7, there was a knock on the door. "Ready?" Alexander asked when she opened it. He looked stunning in a dark suit without a tie. His hair was carefully styled, and the scent of a subtle cologne surrounded him in a pleasant aura. "Ready," she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. "You look beautiful," he said after a moment's hesitation. Sophie felt a blush on her cheeks. "Thank you. You look very handsome too." They went downstairs, where Jessica, Alexander's assistant, was already waiting to stay with the children. Finn and Olivia were sitting in the living room, watching them with curiosity. "Dad, you look like a prince," Olivia exclaimed, clapping her hands. "And Sophie looks like a princess," Finn added. "Are you going to a ball?" Alexander laughed, which was still a rare sight. "No, we're just going to dinner. Be good for Jessica, okay?" Alexander parked in front of a small, cozy restaurant in a historic part of the city. The interior was elegant but intimate: wooden tables, candles, fresh flowers, and subtle background music. Mr. Sterling, an older man, likely the owner, approached them with a smile. "How wonderful to see you again, and with such a beautiful companion." "Good evening, Stefan," Alexander greeted him. "Do you have a table for us?" "Of course, the best one in the house." When Stefan left, Sophie looked around with appreciation. "This place is charming. Did you come here with your wife?" The question popped out before she could think. "Yes," he admitted with a slight smile. "It was our favorite spot. I also came here alone after she passed away, when I needed some peace." "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked," she said quietly. "Don't apologize. It's a part of my life, and I'm glad I can share this place with you." Stefan returned with wine, and the chef prepared a special menu for them. For the next hour, they talked, enjoying exquisite dishes and excellent wine. "You know what's strangest?" Alexander asked at one point. "When I first saw you, I thought, this woman won't even last a week with my children. You were so colorful, so spontaneous, the complete opposite of what I was looking for." "And what were you looking for?" "Someone like me," he admitted. "Organized, methodical, predictable. Someone who would follow my rules and not introduce chaos." "And how did that work out for you with the previous 21 nannies?" she asked with a smile. He laughed. "Point for you. But I still don't understand why you lasted and they didn't." Sophie thought for a moment. "I think the difference is that they tried to control the children, and I try to understand them. Finn and Olivia aren't difficult children. They are intelligent, curious beings who need space to explore." Alexander looked at her with fascination. "You're remarkable, Sophie. You've brought a light into our home that has been missing for a very long time." Their hands rested on the table inches apart. Slowly, Alexander moved his hand until their fingers touched. "Alexander, is this wise? I'm your children's nanny. I work for you. I know, and if you want, we can stop this now, but I don't want to pretend I don't feel what I feel." "And what do you feel?" "That I haven't been this happy in years, that when you walk into a room, everything becomes brighter, that when I watch you with my children, I feel like a piece of my heart that I froze after Madeline's death is starting to thaw again." Sophie felt a rush of emotion. "I feel something too," she admitted, lacing their fingers together. "But I'm scared. What if this doesn't work out? What about the children? I've grown to love them, and I don't want to lose them." "You won't lose them. Whatever happens between us, you will always be a part of their lives. But maybe, let's give ourselves a chance." Sophie nodded. "Okay, let's give ourselves a chance." The drive back was spent in comfortable silence. When they reached the residence, they found Jessica reading a book in the living room. "The children are sleeping like angels," she informed them with a smile. "We had a wonderful evening." When they were alone, Alexander moved closer. "It was a wonderful evening," he said quietly. "The best I've had in a long time," Sophie agreed. They stood so close she could feel the warmth of his body. Slowly, Alexander leaned in and gently kissed her. The kiss was light, almost shy, but full of emotion. "Good night, Sophie," he said as they pulled apart. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, feeling her heart sing. Saturday afternoon brought another challenge: Julia's birthday party, where Sophie was supposed to take Olivia. Alexander had initially planned to stay home with Finn, but the boy begged so much to go too that he finally agreed. The party was held in a garden, colourful balloons, tables with snacks, a bouncy castle, and a group of excited 7-year-olds running around. Olivia immediately joined Julia, and Finn quickly found common ground with some boys building something with blocks. "This was easier than I expected," Alexander muttered as they sat at a table. "See, your children are normal, social beings. They just needed a chance." While talking with other parents, Sophie noticed how Alexander gradually relaxed. Initially stiff and formal, after a few minutes he began to laugh at jokes and discuss the education system. "Are you two together?" One of the mums asked curiously, noticing their exchanged glances. "I'm the children's nanny," Sophie explained quickly, feeling a blush. "A nanny and a family friend," Alexander added, placing his hand on hers. The party lasted for several hours, and the children had a blast. When it was time for the cake, everyone gathered around the table singing "Happy Birthday" to Julia. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly, putting his arm around Sophie. "For what?" "For showing me that life can be full of colours, not just black and white." Their moment was interrupted by a loud cry. Olivia was standing in the middle of the garden, bursting into tears, while another girl held the plush spider Olivia had brought to the party. "Give it back! That's my overlord!" Olivia cried. "It's gross!" the girl shouted, waving the stuffed animal. "Who brings a spider with them?" Before Alexander and Sophie could react, Finn stood in front of his sister. "Give my sister her toy back," he demanded firmly. The girl backed away, but didn't give up the spider. Or what? Finn didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled a small container from his pocket and sprinkled its contents on the girl, flour mixed with colourful glitter. The girl screamed, dropping the spider, and gasps of surprise erupted around them. Finn picked up the plush toy and gave it to Olivia, who hugged it to her chest. "What is this?" the girl asked in fear. "Just flour and glitter," Finn explained calmly. "It'll wash out with water. But next time you take something that isn't yours, I'll use green slime." The girl's parents ran over, looking at the scene with consternation. "I'm sorry for the commotion," Alexander said calmly. "My son reacted impulsively. I will, of course, pay for the cleaning of her clothes." To everyone's surprise, the girl's father laughed. "No need. My daughter wasn't behaving her best either. Anna, apologize to your friend for taking her toy." "Sorry," the girl muttered reluctantly. "Finn, you have something to say too," Alexander reminded him. "I'm sorry I sprinkled you with flour and glitter," Finn said, then added more quietly, "but I'm not sorry I did it." Sophie had to turn her head to hide a smile. Olivia was hugging her spider, looking at her brother with gratitude. "Thank you, Finn. You're the best brother in the world." The ride back from the party was filled with laughter and stories. The children were excited about their new friends, and Finn was clearly proud of himself for defending his sister. "But it worked," Finn noted, as his father gently explained that violence wasn't the best solution. "Yes, it did," Alexander admitted, exchanging an amused look with Sophie. When they got home, the children went to their rooms, tired after an intense day. Sophie and Alexander were left alone in the living room. "That was an interesting day," Alexander said, sitting next to her on the sofa. "You mean the moment your son turned into a little defender of justice?" Sophie laughed. Among other things, I've never seen him stand up for his sister like that before. They're growing. They're changing. It's a normal process. Yes, Alexander agreed, moving closer, and they're not the only ones changing. Sophie felt her heart race as his hand gently brushed her cheek. Alexander, are you sure this is appropriate? No, he admitted with a smile. Probably not. But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something for myself, not just because it's expected. He leaned in and kissed her, this time with more confidence. Sophie responded to the kiss, losing herself in the feeling. So what now? She asked when they broke apart. Now we try, day by day. No pressure, no expectations. And the children? We won't tell them anything for now, he decided. We need time to understand what this is ourselves before we involve Finn and Olivia. Sophie nodded. That made sense. The following days brought a new dynamic to their relationship. Around the children they acted professionally, but when Finn and Olivia were asleep or busy playing, they allowed themselves small gestures of affection. On Wednesday evening, when the children were already asleep and Sophie was finishing cleaning the kitchen, Alexander unexpectedly hugged her from behind. I thought about you all day, he whispered, kissing her neck. Sophie turned in his arms. Just thought? She asked playfully. Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of little feet on the stairs. They quickly moved apart as Olivia entered the kitchen, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Dad? Sophie? I can't sleep. The Overlord says there's a monster under my bed. They exchanged glances, and Sophie immediately switched into nanny mode. Well, we have to check, don't we? Come on, we'll chase away all the monsters together. As Sophie went upstairs with Olivia, Alexander stayed in the kitchen, smiling to himself. This woman was amazing. One moment a passionate lover, the next a caring guardian. He was falling more in love with her every day, but not everything was going perfectly. On Thursday during lunch, Finn suddenly asked, Dad, is Sophie your girlfriend now? Alexander choked on his coffee, and Sophie froze with her fork in the air. What makes you ask that? Alexander asked, trying to sound natural. Because I saw you kissing in the kitchen, the boy replied matter-of-factly, and you hold hands when you think we're not looking. Alexander and Sophie exchanged surprised glances. They had underestimated the 7-year-old's perceptiveness. I saw it too, Olivia added, biting into her sandwich. And I heard Sophie call you Alexander, not Mr. Sterling. Well, Alexander searched for the right words. Yes, Sophie and I have become friends. I like her very much. Does that mean Sophie will be our new mom? Olivia asked with hope in her voice. Now it was Sophie's turn to choke on her tea. Sweetheart, it's complicated, she began cautiously. Your dad and I are just getting to know each other this way. We don't know what will come of it yet. But you'll stay our nanny, right? Finn asked, suddenly worried. You won't leave like the others? I won't leave, she promised, taking his small hand. No matter what happens between me and your dad, I will always be here for you. Finn nodded, reassured, but Olivia still looked thoughtful. I want you to stay forever, she said finally. You're the best nanny, and Dad smiles when you're around. Alexander looked at his daughter with affection. You're right, sweetie. Sophie makes me smile. The atmosphere at the table relaxed, but Sophie felt that their little secret had now become official. They were now something of a family. The thought both terrified and filled her with joy. In the evening, when the children were asleep, Sophie and Alexander sat in the living room, talking about this new situation. I didn't think they'd figure us out so quickly, Alexander admitted, playing with a strand of her hair. Children are more perceptive than we think, Sophie replied. But they seem to be accepting of it. More than accepting, he smiled. Olivia is already planning the wedding. Sophie laughed, but then grew serious. Alexander, isn't this happening too fast? It's only been a few weeks since we met. Sometimes it's not about the time, but the feeling, he replied, taking her hand, and I've never felt anything like this. Even with Madeline, it was different. It was youthful, passionate. What I feel for you is deeper, more mature. Sophie felt her heart race. "I feel something special too," she admitted, "but I'm afraid we'll hurt the children if this doesn't work out. Or maybe we can just trust that it will," he proposed, pulling her close. "Day by day, without pressure. Just the four of us, trying to create something beautiful." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, thinking about the strange path that had led her to this moment. She was supposed to be just a temporary nanny, and now she was becoming part of this small, unconventional family. Life was full of surprises, and this was one of the most beautiful ones. The next few weeks passed like a fairy tale. Sophie found her role in the Sterling family. She was a nanny, a friend to the children, and a partner to Alexander. Their relationship, initially kept secret, became known to their immediate circle, eliciting mixed reactions. Jessica, Alexander's assistant, was thrilled and didn't spare comments like, "I knew from the beginning you two were perfect for each other." The parents of other children at the parties they increasingly took Finn and Olivia to were initially surprised, but quickly got used to the sight of the stern millionaire holding hands with the colourful nanny. That summer morning, Sophie was sitting on the terrace, enjoying her morning coffee and watching Finn and Olivia work on their latest project, a mini garden for insects. Olivia was carefully planting butterfly-attracting plants, while Finn was constructing small houses for bees. "Sophie, do bees like blue or yellow flowers?" Olivia asked, holding two seedlings. "They like both colors, but they are particularly attracted to blue, purple, and yellow," Sophie replied with a smile. "So I'll plant them all," the girl decided, getting to work with new enthusiasm. Sophie watched them with affection. Over the past few weeks, the children had blossomed. They had become more open, creative, and confident. Finn was no longer afraid to experiment outside the established rules, and Olivia had learned to express her emotions in a healthier way than through pranks. "A beautiful sight, isn't it?" Alexander's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood beside her, handing her a fresh cup of coffee. "The most beautiful," she agreed, accepting the drink. "Remember how they were afraid to touch the dirt so they wouldn't get messy?" Alexander laughed quietly. "I remember panicking when Olivia first came back from the yard with mud behind her ears." "And look at them now!" Sophie pointed to the children, who were happily getting dirty with soil. "Normal, happy kids." Alexander put his arm around her, kissing the top of her head. "It's all thanks to you," he said quietly. "You changed our lives." "We changed them together," she corrected him, snuggling into his side. "You've changed too, you know. You're not that stiff, controlling man I met on the first day anymore." "Really?" He feigned surprise. "And what happened to me?" "Well, yesterday you let the children have ice cream for an afternoon snack," she reminded him with a smile. "And not the organic, sugar-free kind, but real chocolate ice cream with sprinkles. That was a moment of weakness," he defended himself playfully. "Don't get used to it." Their banter was interrupted by Alexander's phone ringing. He looked at the screen and frowned. "I have to take this," he apologized, stepping aside. Sophie watched as his face grew serious during the conversation. Whatever he heard, it wasn't good news. "Is everything all right?" she asked when he returned. "Not really," he sighed. "I have a problem at the company. I have to fly to Berlin for a few days. An important client is threatening to break the contract." "Oh." Sophie felt a pang of disappointment. "When are you leaving?" "Tonight," he replied, rubbing his forehead. "I'm sorry it's so sudden. I was hoping we could spend the weekend together." "It's okay," she assured him, though deep down she was disappointed. "Work is important. We'll be here when you get back." Alexander looked at her with gratitude. "What would I do without you?" he asked, kissing her lightly on the lips. "Probably hire nanny number 23, she joked. When evening came and it was time for Alexander to leave, the children were clearly sad, though they tried to hide it. "Just 3 days, right, Dad?" Finn made sure as Alexander packed his suitcase. 4 at most," he promised, folding his shirts. "I'll handle it as quickly as possible." "Will you bring us something from Berlin?" Olivia asked, sitting on his bed with her plush spider hugged to her chest. "Of course," he smiled. "What do you want?" A model of a space rocket for me, Finn replied immediately. And a book about German spiders for me, Olivia requested. Alexander shook his head in amusement. I'll try to find those treasures, he promised, closing the suitcase. And you promise me you'll listen to Sophie and won't conduct any science experiments in the bathtub. We promise, they replied in unison, but their eyes twinkled with mischief. When the children went to play, Alexander pulled Sophie close. I'll miss you, he said quietly, resting his forehead against hers. Me too, she replied, snuggling into him. But it's just a few days. This is the first time I'm leaving you all alone since... He hesitated. Since we've been together. We'll be fine, she assured him. Don't worry about us. Focus on your work. Alexander looked deep into her eyes. Sophie, he began, but stopped as if searching for the right words. Yes, she encouraged him. I'll call you when I get to the hotel, he finished, though Sophie had the impression he wanted to say something else. I'll be waiting, she smiled, trying to hide her slight disappointment. The first day without Alexander passed peacefully. Sophie took the children to the park, then for ice cream. Since Dad wasn't there, they could even have double scoops. And in the evening, they had a movie marathon with popcorn and a blanket spread out on the living room floor. It's like camping, but at home, Olivia exclaimed, comfortably nestled among the pillows. It's called a blanket fort, Finn explained, proud of his knowledge. In the old days, people built them to protect themselves from wild animals. Really? Olivia asked doubtfully. No, I made it up, the boy admitted, bursting into laughter. But it sounded scientific, didn't it? Sophie joined their laughter, happy that Finn was starting to develop a sense of humor. When the movie ended and the children were getting ready for bed, Sophie's phone rang. It was Alexander. How's your day going? He asked when she answered. Wonderful, she replied, stepping out onto the terrace to talk more freely. We went to the park, had ice cream, and had a movie night. Sounds better than my boring business meetings, he sighed. How are the kids? They miss you, but they're having fun. Finn has started telling jokes, and Olivia, well, she's currently teaching her plush spider the national anthem. Alexander laughed. That sounds like our Olivia, he said affectionately. And you? How are you feeling? Good, she assured him. A little empty without you, but we're managing. I miss you all, he admitted quietly. I miss you. We miss you too. When are you coming back? Hopefully the day after tomorrow. The negotiations are tougher than I expected. They talked for a while about his meetings, the problems with the client, and then about the small details of their day. It was nice. This normality, the feeling that despite the distance, they were still connected. Sophie, Alexander said suddenly, his voice serious. There's something I wanted to tell you before I left, but I didn't have the courage. Yes? Her heart sped up. He hesitated. I love you. I know it's fast, but I'm sure of what I feel. Sophie felt her eyes well up with tears. I love you too, she replied softly, and I don't care if it's too fast. She could almost hear his smile through the phone. I'm coming back as soon as possible, he promised, and when I get back we need to talk about the future. The future? Yes, he confirmed. About us, about you, me, the children, about what this is all supposed to look like. Sophie felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Okay, she agreed. We'll talk when you get back. After ending the call, she stood on the terrace for a while longer, looking at the starry sky. Alexander loved her, and she loved him. Was it really that simple? The second day without Alexander brought an unexpected challenge. As Sophie was bustling around the kitchen preparing breakfast, she heard the doorbell ring. They weren't expecting anyone, so she went to open it, intrigued. In the doorway stood an elegant woman in her 50s, dressed in an expensive suit with perfectly styled hair. She looked at Sophie with a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Good morning, Sophie greeted. Can I help you? Where is Alexander? The woman asked, ignoring the greeting. He's on a business trip, Sophie replied, feeling uncomfortable under the stranger's scrutinizing gaze. May I ask who you are? "I am Helen Sterling, Alexander's mother," the woman announced in a tone that suggested Sophie should have known. "And who are you?" "Sophia Hayes, Finn and Olivia's nanny," Sophie introduced herself, extending her hand. Helen glanced at her hand but did not shake it. "The nanny," she repeated with a slight smile. "Of course. May I come in? I'd like to see my grandchildren." Sophie stepped aside, letting the woman in. Helen looked around the hall with clear appraisal in her eyes. "I see Alexander has allowed for some changes," she commented, looking at the children's colourful drawings attached to the refrigerator and a bouquet of wildflowers on the table. "The children like to be surrounded by colour," Sophie replied diplomatically. At that moment, Finn and Olivia ran down the stairs, stopping abruptly at the sight of the guest. "Grandma!" they called in unison, but without the enthusiasm that usually accompanied greetings. "My dears!" Helen spread her arms, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "How you've grown!" The children came to hug her, but their embraces were quick and stiff. "What's new with you?" Helen asked, sitting on the sofa in the living room. "How's school, extracurriculars?" While the children answered their grandmother's questions, Sophie went to the kitchen to finish preparing breakfast. She felt a strange unease. Alexander had never mentioned his mother, and the children rarely spoke of their grandmother. Now she understood why. Helen Sterling exuded coldness and judgment. "Can I offer you some coffee?" she asked, returning to the living room. "Black, no sugar," Helen replied, not taking her eyes off her grandchildren. "Children, go get changed. Those clothes are inappropriate." Finn and Olivia looked at their colourful t-shirts and shorts, then questioningly at Sophie. "Your clothes are fine," Sophie assured them with a smile. "But maybe you could bring your grandmother the drawings you made yesterday. I'm sure she'd love to see them." The children took the opportunity to escape, and Sophie was left alone with Helen. "So, Miss Hayes," the older woman began as Sophie handed her the coffee, "how long have you been working for my son?" "About 2 months," Sophie replied, sitting opposite her. "And you're already so settled in that you let guests in during your employer's absence?" Helen raised an eyebrow. "I live here 5 days a week, taking care of the children," Sophie explained, trying to remain calm. "Alexander has authorized me to make decisions regarding the house and the children during his absence." "I see," Helen said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "And how is taking care of my grandchildren going?" "I see there have been some changes in discipline." "The children are developing wonderfully," Sophie replied with a smile. "They are creative, curious, and very intelligent." "They have always been intelligent," Helen stated with pride. "It's a sterling trait, but Alexander always ensured proper structure and discipline in their upbringing. Now I see a loosening." Before Sophie could reply, Helen continued, "My son told me on the phone that he has a new nanny who has changed their lives. He didn't mention, however, that this change includes abandoning all the rules he established." "We haven't abandoned the rules," Sophie protested. "We've adapted them to the children's needs." Finn and Olivia needed more space for expression and play. Helen looked at her carefully. "Ms. Hayes, I worked as a child psychologist for 30 years. I know what children need. Structure, predictability, clear boundaries. That gives them a sense of security." "With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling, but every child is different," Sophie replied calmly. Finn and Olivia were living in a rigid framework that was stifling their natural curiosity and creativity. Now they are flourishing. "Flourishing?" Helen repeated with a slight smirk. "Well, we'll see what Alexander has to say about these changes when he returns." Their conversation was interrupted by the children returning with their drawings. Helen gave them a few minutes of her attention and then announced she had to go. "I only came for a moment to check how you're managing in your father's absence," she explained, standing up. "I'll be back tomorrow to spend more time with you." When Helen left, Sophie felt the tension leave her body. This woman was exactly what one would expect from the mother of the old Alexander, stiff, controlling, convinced of her own infallibility. "Grandma doesn't like you," Olivia noted as they sat down for breakfast. "What makes you say that?" Sophie asked, trying to sound light-hearted. "She looked at you the same way she looked at Mrs. Pear, nanny number 8, Finn explained. "And she didn't like her either." "Grandma doesn't like anyone who isn't like her," Olivia added. "That's why she didn't like Mom either." Sophie froze with her cup at her lips. "She didn't like your mother?" "No," Finn shook his head. "She always said Mom was too artistic and irresponsible for Dad, but Dad and Mom still loved each other." "And Dad loves you," Olivia added with a smile. "So Grandma won't like you either." Sophie didn't know whether to laugh or worry at this childish logic. "Well, what's important is that you like me," she said, ruffling their hair. "Now, who's ready for pancakes?" In the evening, when the children were asleep, Sophie spoke with Alexander on the phone, recounting his mother's visit. "I'm sorry about her," he said apologetically. "I should have warned you she might drop by. She always does when I'm away." "Don't apologize," she reassured him. "But yes, a warning would have been nice." "How did she react to you?" "Well," Sophie hesitated. "Let's just say we won't be becoming best friends." Alexander sighed. "My mother has a specific way of looking at the world. She's convinced her parenting methods are the only correct ones. And yes, she has a PhD in child psychology, which she always brings up whenever someone questions her approach." "She did just that," Sophie admitted, "but I'm not worried about it. What matters is that the children are happy." "And they are," Alexander confirmed. "Thanks to you. Don't let my mother intimidate you, okay? She's a master of manipulation and can make you feel guilty." "I'll try," she promised. "When are you coming back?" "Tomorrow evening," he replied with relief in his voice. "I managed to convince the client to give us another chance." "That's wonderful. We'll be waiting." "I love you," he said quietly, and those words still sounded new and exciting to her. "I love you too," she replied, feeling a warmth spread through her heart. After they hung up, Sophie sat on the terrace, looking up at the night sky. Helen's visit had unsettled her. The woman clearly disapproved of the changes Sophie had brought to the family's life. Would she try to influence Alexander to return to his old, rigid rules? Would she try to separate them? Sophie shook her head, banishing the thoughts. Alexander loved her. The children loved her. Whatever Helen Sterling was planning, their newly formed family was stronger than her disapproval. With that thought, she went to bed, waiting for Alexander's return and the conversation about the future he had promised. Did he mean what she thought he meant? Was their relationship heading in the direction she secretly dreamed of? The day of Alexander's return from Berlin brought unexpected complications. Helen Sterling, as promised, appeared in the early afternoon, this time with the clear intention of staying longer. "I thought I'd stay until Alexander gets back," she announced, bringing in a small suitcase. "The children need proper care." Sophie swallowed the comment that was on the tip of her tongue. Instead, she smiled politely. "As you wish, we'll prepare the guest room." Helen looked around the house with disapproval. "This house needs some order," she commented, looking at the colorful children's drawings tacked to the walls and the scattered toys in the living room. "In my day, when I visited Alexander, everything was in its place." "It is in its place now," Sophie replied calmly. "Children need a space where they can express themselves." Helen raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, she headed to the kitchen. "What are you planning for dinner?" she asked, opening the refrigerator and grimacing at its contents. "The children asked for pasta with tomato sauce," Sophie explained, joining her. "It's their favorite dish." "Pasta?" Helen shook her head in disapproval. "Carbohydrates, sugar, gluten? No, that is not suitable food for developing minds. I'll prepare them something healthier." Before Sophie could protest, Helen was already taking out ingredients and starting to prepare some complicated dish with quinoa and vegetables that, as Sophie well knew, the children would hate. Finn and Olivia, who had been playing in the garden, came into the kitchen, stopping in their tracks at the sight of their grandmother at the stove. "What are you doing, Grandma?" Olivia asked cautiously. "I'm preparing a healthy dinner for you, darling," Helen replied, with a forced smile. Quinoa with roasted vegetables and tofu. It will give you energy for your studies. The children exchanged horrified glances. But Sophie promised us pasta, Finn noted, looking to Sophie for support. I did promise, Sophie confirmed, approaching Helen. Mrs. Sterling, I appreciate your concern, but the children have been looking forward to this pasta all day. Children don't always know what's best for them, Helen replied coolly. It's the job of adults to make the right decisions about their health, and I am the adult to whom Alexander has entrusted the care of his children, Sophie reminded her, trying to remain calm. And I respect their choices as long as they are reasonable. Helen stopped chopping vegetables and looked down at Sophie. Ms. Hayes, it seems to me you are forgetting your position in this house, she said in an icy tone. You are merely an employee, a nanny who can be replaced at any moment. I am the grandmother of these children, and Alexander is my son. Sophie felt her cheeks burn, but before she could reply, Finn unexpectedly stepped forward. Sophie is not just a nanny, he said firmly. She's our friend, and Dad's too. He loves her. Helen froze, staring at her grandson. What did you say? Dad loves Sophie, Olivia repeated, standing next to her brother. And we love her too, and she loves us. We're a family. Helen looked as if she had been slapped. Slowly, she put down the knife and wiped her hands on a cloth. I see, she said quietly. So that's how it is. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the sound of boiling water. Sophie didn't know what to say. The children had just revealed her relationship with Alexander, and she wasn't sure how Helen would react. Children, go play upstairs, Helen instructed finally. I need to speak with Ms. Hayes alone. Finn and Olivia looked uncertainly at Sophie, who nodded with a reassuring smile. Go on, you two. I'll call you for dinner. When the children reluctantly left, Helen sat at the kitchen table, gesturing for Sophie to do the same. For a moment, they sized each other up. So, my son has fallen in love with you, Helen stated finally. Yes, Sophie confirmed, lifting her chin, and I with him. And you live in his house, taking care of his children. Exactly. Helen sighed heavily. Ms. Hayes, please tell me, what do you see in this? Alexander is a wealthy widower with 2 children. A young, attractive woman like you, well, you wouldn't be the first to see an opportunity in that. Sophie felt anger rising in her chest. With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling, but you have no idea what I feel for Alexander and his children, she replied coolly. I'm not interested in his money. I fell in love with him for who he is, for his care for the children, for his intelligence, for the way he sees the world. And I fell in love with Finn and Olivia because they are wonderful, unique children. Did you fall in love with their mother too? Helen asked suddenly. Excuse me? Madeline, did you fall in love with her too? Because she is still a part of this family, even though she's gone. Sophie hesitated, surprised by the question. I didn't know Madeline, she admitted, but I respect her memory and the place she holds in Alexander's and the children's hearts. I have never tried to replace her. Helen watched her carefully, as if searching for a lie on her face. Alexander was devastated after her death, she said quietly. He closed himself off, focused all his energy on the children and work. For 4 years he didn't look at another woman. And now suddenly you appear, and everything changes. It didn't happen suddenly, Sophie protested. It was a process, a slow discovery that we could be more to each other, that we could be happy together. Helen was silent for a moment, staring at the tabletop. My son always had a weakness for artistic souls, she said finally. Madeline was the same, spontaneous, full of life, always ready to break the rules. The complete opposite of how I raised him. And he was happy with her, Sophie noted gently. Yes, Helen admitted with a sigh. He was, and he suffered when he lost her. She looked up, looking straight into Sophie's eyes. I don't want him to suffer again. I don't want that either, Sophie assured her sincerely. I just want him to be happy, for the children to be happy. And what about you? What do you want for yourself? Sophie thought for a moment. I want to be where I am loved and where I can love, she replied simply. And that place is right here with them. Helen looked at her for a long time, her face gradually softening. You are sincere, she stated finally. That's good. Alexander needs someone who will tell him the truth, even when he doesn't want to hear it. I try, Sophie smiled slightly, but Helen raised a finger. If you ever hurt him, you will have to deal with me. And believe me, Ms. Hayes, you do not want me as an enemy. I have no intention of doing so, Sophie assured her. And please, call me Sophie. Helen nodded, and then, to Sophie's surprise, she smiled slightly. In that case, Sophie, maybe we should prepare that pasta for the children after all, but let's add some fresh vegetables to it, shall we? When evening came, and it was time for Alexander's return, the atmosphere in the house was surprisingly calm. Helen, though still a bit stiff, had stopped openly criticizing Sophie's methods. They prepared dinner together, and then Helen even joined their evening ritual of reading Harry Potter, showing unexpected acting talents when playing the characters' voices. "Grandma, you're the best Hagrid in the world!" Olivia laughed as Helen imitated the gruff voice of the Hogwarts gamekeeper. The sound of the front door opening interrupted their reading. Finn and Olivia jumped up and ran to the hall. "Dad's back!" they shouted, throwing themselves at Alexander's neck as soon as he crossed the threshold. "My little ones!" he laughed, hugging them tightly. "I missed you so much." Sophie stood in the living room doorway, watching the scene with a smile. When Alexander looked up and saw her, his face brightened even more. "Sophie," he said quietly, and there was such tenderness in his voice that she felt her heart race. He walked over to her, still holding the children's hands, and leaned in to kiss her. It was a short but tender kiss that said everything. He had missed her. He was glad to be back. He loved her. "Ahem." Helen's clearing of her throat interrupted their moment. Alexander turned sharply, only now noticing his mother standing in the back of the living room. "Mom," he asked in surprise, "what are you doing here?" "Welcome, son," Helen replied, coming to hug him. "I came to see how my grandchildren are doing under the care of the nanny, and I see they are doing interestingly." Alexander looked questioningly at Sophie, who just shrugged with a slight smile. "Mom, we need to talk," he said seriously. "Yes, we do," Helen agreed. "But first, rest after your trip. The children have a surprise for you." "A surprise?" Alexander looked at the children, who were nodding enthusiastically. "We painted you a picture," Olivia exclaimed. "All of us together." "Even Grandma helped," Finn added, pulling his father by the hand towards the dining room. On the dining room table was a large watercolor painting. It depicted 4 figures holding hands, a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl, standing in front of a house similar to their residence. A bright sun shone above them, and colorful butterflies flew around. "That's us," Olivia explained, pointing to the figures. "You, Sophie, me, and Finn, our family." Alexander looked at the painting, his eyes shining suspiciously. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, hugging the children. "Thank you." Sophie stood to the side, moved by the gesture. Helen approached her and whispered, "I didn't expect to join in painting a family portrait when I got here, but the children were very convincing." "They can be," Sophie smiled, "and I see that my son is truly happy," Helen added, watching Alexander laugh with the children. "And that's all I want for him." Late in the evening, when the children were asleep and Helen had retired to her room, Sophie and Alexander finally found a moment for themselves. They sat on the terrace, looking at the starry sky, their hands clasped. "I'm sorry about my mother," Alexander said, stroking the back of her hand with his thumb. "She can be difficult. And Daddy said she turned out to be quite bearable once we got past the mutual sniffing stage." Sophie laughed. "I think she even started to like me when she saw the children preparing that painting." "My mother doesn't like anyone right away," Alexander sighed. "She had to make sure your intentions were pure first." "And did I pass the test?" "Definitely," he smiled, kissing her lightly. Otherwise, she wouldn't have let you appear in the family portrait." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying their closeness. Finally, Alexander cleared his throat, clearly nervous. "Sophie, we talked on the phone about the future," he began, turning to look her in the eyes, "and I'd like to continue that conversation now." "I'm listening," she replied, feeling her heart race. "These 2 months have been the happiest time of my life in a very long time," he said quietly. "You, me, the children, we've created something special, something I don't want to lose." "Me neither," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "And that's why," he continued, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small box, "I would like to ask you to be my wife." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful ring with a delicate sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. Sophie felt tears well up in her eyes. It was so unexpected, yet so perfect. "Alexander," she whispered, are you proposing to me?" "Yes," he confirmed with a smile. "I know it's fast, that we've only known each other for 2 months, but I feel it's right. That you are the one I want to spend the rest of my life with." Sophie looked at the ring, and then at his hopeful face. She thought about the day she first crossed the threshold of this house, about all the moments that had led her to this one. Finn's first smile, Olivia's trust, the slow melting of Alexander's icy shell. "Yes," she replied finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I will be your wife." Alexander slid the ring onto her finger and then kissed her with such tenderness and passion that she forgot the whole world. When they pulled apart, they both had tears in their eyes. "I love you, Sophie Hayes," he said, resting his forehead against hers. "And I love you, Alexander Sterling," she replied, feeling happiness fill her completely. Suddenly, they heard a quiet giggle coming from behind the terrace doors. They turned and saw 2 small figures trying to hide behind the curtain. "Finn? Olivia?" Alexander asked, raising an eyebrow. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" The children came out from behind the curtain, looking guilty but excited. "We heard you," Olivia admitted, "and we wanted to see if Sophie said yes." "Did she?" Finn asked, bouncing with impatience. "Yes, I did," Sophie confirmed, showing them the ring. The children let out a cheer of joy and threw themselves at them, creating a spontaneous group hug. "So now you'll really be our mom?" Olivia asked, looking at Sophie with hope. Sophie looked at Alexander, unsure how to answer, but he just nodded with a smile. "I won't replace your mother," she said gently, stroking the girl's hair. "She will always be in your hearts. But yes, if you'll let me, I will be your second mom, and I will love you with all my heart." "I already love you," Finn said simply, hugging her. "Me too," Olivia added, "and I'm glad you're staying with us forever." Sophie hugged them tightly, feeling happiness spread through her heart. She had never imagined that working as a millionaire's nanny would lead her to this place, to love, to family, to the home she had always wanted. She looked at Alexander over the children's heads, and in his eyes she saw the same thing. Gratitude for the unexpected gift they had received, and hope for a shared future full of love and laughter. "Forever," she repeated, smiling at her new family. "That sounds perfect." The wedding took place the following summer, in the garden of their home. It was an intimate but beautiful ceremony, with Finn as the best man and Olivia as the maid of honor, scattering flower petals from a basket that also held the plush spider, the Overlord. Helen Sterling, to everyone's surprise, was the most involved in the preparations, taking care of every detail from the flowers to the menu. On the day of the ceremony, as Sophie stood before the mirror in her simple yet elegant dress, she was surprised to see Helen in the doorway. "You look beautiful," the older woman said, approaching her. "Alexander will be enchanted." "Thank you," Sophie smiled, "and thank you for helping with the arrangements. Everything is perfect." Helen nodded, then pulled out a small box. "I wanted to give you this," she said, handing it to Sophie. "It belonged to Madeline. I think she would have wanted you to have it." Sophie opened the box and saw a delicate bracelet with a small sapphire matching her engagement ring. "Helen, I can't," she began. But the older woman stopped her, placing a hand on her arm. "You can, and you should," she said firmly. "Madeline was a part of our family and always will be. And now you are too. This is a symbol of continuity, not replacement." Sophie felt tears well up in her eyes. She nodded, letting Helen fasten the bracelet on her wrist. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This means a lot to me." "To me too," Helen admitted, and then, to Sophie's surprise, she hugged her briefly. "Now let's go. My son is waiting, and he's never been a patient man." The ceremony was simple and moving. As Alexander and Sophie exchanged vows, Finn and Olivia stood beside them, holding hands and smiling broadly. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Sophie and Alexander, but for their entire little family. Later during the reception, as guests danced and laughed in the garden lit by hundreds of lanterns, Sophie found a moment to sit alone and admire the scene. Her husband, how strange and wonderful that word sounded, was talking with friends, occasionally glancing at her with a smile that made her heart race. Finn and Olivia ran among the guests, proud in their elegant outfits, telling anyone who would listen that Sophie is now officially their mom. Helen sat beside her, handing her a glass of champagne. "Happy?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "More than I ever thought possible," Sophie admitted, accepting the drink. "Good," Helen nodded. "My son deserves to be happy, and so do you." They watched together as Alexander swept the children up for a dance, spinning with them in a circle until all three were laughing loudly. "I've never seen him like this," Helen said quietly. "So free, so happy." "He's changed," Sophie agreed. "We've all changed." "For the better," Helen added, clinking her glass against Sophie's. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Sophie repeated, smiling as Alexander approached them, extending a hand to her. "May I have this dance with my wife?" he asked, with the smile that still made her heart melt. "Always," she replied, rising and letting him lead her to the dance floor. As they danced under the stars, surrounded by the people they loved, Sophie thought about the path that had led her to this moment. From the first day she had hesitantly crossed the threshold of the Sterling home, to today, when that house had become her home, and these people her family. Life was full of surprises. Who would have thought that working as a nanny for a rigid millionaire would lead her to the greatest happiness she had ever known? That she would find not only love, but a family, a place where she truly belonged. Looking into her husband's eyes, she felt that everything was exactly as it should be. Their story was just beginning, and she couldn't wait for every chapter to come. "I love you, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I love you, Mrs. Sterling," he replied, kissing her lightly, "more than I ever thought possible." And so, dancing under the stars, surrounded by their new family, Sophie and Alexander began a new journey, full of love, laughter, and the adventures that awaited them all.